There were two stats, Lee, that really stuck with me in there. One of them was 70% of employees cite healthcare as their most important benefit, but more than a quarter find it really stressful to select their plan. And so, again, it just underscores for me that it's a really necessary but really complex area.
Welcome to Broken Benefits. I'm your host, Lee Lewis, and this is a podcast where we learn from top employer experts on how to fix our broken benefits to save lives, save dollars, and save your talent. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So excited about today's guest, Tom Plath. Tom is the chairman of the HTA, and he's one of the founding members who helped create the HTA, and is also the former CHRO at International Paper, and one of the rare CHROs who is deeply interested in and helping to form and make meaningful changes for healthcare, both in setting strategy for his own organizations and then helping to spread that more broadly so that we as employers can help to realign the incentives of American healthcare. So excited to have him on the show today. Tom, welcome, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Lee. Glad to be here.
So jumping right in, many people don't realize that most of the employer healthcare expenses roll up into HR leaders that ultimately stop at the CHRO. Yet we don't always see CHROs become active in healthcare strategy despite the cost. And I was wondering if you could help to demystify that a little bit for us about how CHROs and other executives think about healthcare within the context of large firms.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind here, Lee, is that most leaders would view this as a necessary but really complex expense. And so let me just break that apart a bit. I think it's necessary. Employees and their families depend on it. And most organizations today will offer some kind of health care, and it is a valued benefit, but it is really complex. The supply chain, the number of players, the number of options, the type of advice you receive, all of that, because it's necessary and because it's complex, makes this really hard to deal with. Let me just add a quick stat. The CEO of the HTA, Rob Andrews, just wrote an op-ed recently for the Med City News. It was under the title of How Employers Can Leverage Value-Based Care to Drive Retention and Improved Health Outcomes for Employees. And there were two stats, Lee, that really stuck with me in there. One of them was 70% of employees cite healthcare as their most important benefit, but more than a quarter find it really stressful to select their plan. And so, again, it just underscores for me that it's a really necessary but really complex area.
As executives look at this, it's necessary but complex. What's the default way that most executives then try to manage it?
I think that, like so many other complex things, the analogy that I would use, Lee, is that a lot of leaders today, they would prefer not to be driving the car. They would prefer to be riding in the car. And by that, I mean, I think that a lot of leaders today, it is almost too complex to pull it apart and put it back together again. And so by default, you rely on consultants, you rely on people who believe that you believe are experts in this space. And as a result of that, you get what you get. And you don't control the outcomes and the plans. All you can control are the selections that you make from what you're given.
Everyone, now just a quick word from today's sponsor.
The Lockbox is a place where all of our customers' healthcare benefits data is brought together into a single location that allows us to then extract insight and have repeatable value built on top of it. There's so many different pieces of information that are floating around out there that it can be hard to know what's the important elements to pay attention to and what's the underlying noise that's in the data. So what I think we do that's really critical is we help bring our expertise and our experience in modeling to help our customers understand where the real value is that enables them to make the best decision for their member population that they support. For the first time, there's a commonly understood, centrally located data model that all of your different data sources can live and that you are able to trust the quality of, to trust the security of, and ultimately to trust the insights that you're going to get out of the data that you have.
Right. And naturally, a lot of people will say, well, shoot, why don't you invest a little to learn more about it so that you can kind of control it yourself? And you, I think, went through a similar process of that where you became very activated around healthcare. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your story and what made that possible.
I was with International Paper for a long time, and a lot of that time period was in HR. When you're in HR, especially in operating HR roles, you're adjacent to healthcare. You know how important it is, but you also are not in the middle of it. I became CHRO in early 2017 for International Paper, and I was just going through the normal process of trying to figure out what was it that I had responsibility for. And I came across what I found was a really interesting set of numbers. So every year, we obviously had a short-term a bonus plan that we worked with in executive comp. We had a long-term incentive plan that was stock-based. Each of those plans was about $150 million a year expense for International Paper. And then I looked at medical and the healthcare plan, and it was 500 million. And so again, 150 million for the bonus plan, 150 million for the long-term incentive plan, 500 million a year for medical. And I thought about how much time am I spending on those compensation elements of the benefits and comp plans? And how much time am I spending on medical? And how valuable is it to the organization if we're spending that much? And so I started to get into it. And candidly, Lee, one of the first things you realize as you go through that process is how little you know about this space. And so it was scary. It was intimidating for me. And so you have to get through that, like so many other things, and really put your shoulder into it to make sure that you can understand it, and then you can start to affect it.
I love that. Uh, some people might say, well, you're dealing with high complexity all the time with all the compliance that goes into HR, for instance, and making sure that you're competitive across, tens of thousands of employees and different comp structures and things like that. And then you've got 401k and retirement and other areas. What is it that separates healthcare so it gets a pass?
I think in general, first of all, let's understand there've been a number of articles that have been written lately about the complexity of CHRO roles in the C-suite, and some articles have said it might be the second hardest job in the C-suite. I don't know whether that's true or not. Let's just agree that it's a really difficult, broad, deep role. And so, by definition, there are a lot of things that you have responsibility for. You named some of them, Lee. And you want to make sure that what you're doing in each of those areas makes sense for the organization, and you're focused on the right things, et cetera. So when I thought about healthcare, what I realized, I already cited the numbers, $500 million a year. It's a lot of money to spend in one area. But the other part of this that was really clear for me, this is a highly, highly emotional area for our employees and their families. Healthcare, by definition, is that way. And so as a result, here you have an area where it is really, really expensive and it's really important to our employees. And I think by virtue of both of those types of aspects of it, it rises to the surface of importance.
As you started to take a closer look here, what were some of the key, I guess, business problems or systemic problems that you started to identify that jumped out that looking at it from the CHRO lens, from a C-suite lens, you said, okay, these are some really obvious problems that we ought to tackle?
One of the one of the most fundamental issues was the issue that I confronted, and that is it was so complex that it was intimidating to get into. It is like so many other things that we deal with in life, in business, in our work, etc., that we tend to go to areas that we know and understand really easily, and those receive our focus. This one is really hard. And when I joined the HTA, I immediately became responsible for the medical strategy part of the HTA. And so I was with other CHROs trying to figure this out. And I asked for the supply chain, a depiction of the healthcare supply chain, expecting that there was some professional expert opinion on what this looked like. And the answer was that we had to Google it. And the outcome that we got from Google, it had a whole number of variants to it. And so one of the first things that we had to do, like in so many other areas of business, is you can't affect how a service or a product is delivered unless you understand the supply chain. And that was problem number one, is how do you understand the supply chain? And once you do understand it, do you understand how the money moves and where the incentives are and how people benefit and where the value is? That was job one. The second thing is the number of stakeholders, Lee, in this space. It's absurd. It's an incredible number of organizations and individuals that can have an effect and want to have an effect on how you think about the space. And so understanding, like you do in any kind of change management, who the stakeholders are was really, really critical. And then going through and asking, what can we actually change? What is possible to change in this space if we want to affect change? What's possible? And then going through and developing plans. It was like so many other business case studies that you get into, where before you understand what you can do, you have to understand what the problem is.
I love this framework of working through it at a systems level, at a full supply chain level, to understand the parties. As you ran that analysis, what were some, as it started to come into better focus, what were some of the things that jumped off the page that caught your attention?
Well, the first thing that we did was redesign the supply chain so that when you think about the delivery of healthcare inside of a self-insured organization, some large percentage, 70, 75, 80% of the cost is borne by the organization. 20, 25, 30% of the cost is borne by the consumer. So the company or the organization is essentially the payer. On the other end of the supply chain are the people who are receiving the care, our employees and their families. And so what we did was we established a supply chain that simply had companies, organizations that were self-insured on one end of the supply chain and consumers on the other end of the supply chain. Everything else was in between. And what you found when you looked at what was between that was a huge amount of the inside of that supply chain was owned and governed by the carriers, the BUCAs, the Blues, United, Cigna, Aetna. Though that's where a lot of the power was. And so whether you choose to accept that, that's not derisive about those organizations by any means. They were filling a void in the supply chain. But if we were going to make sure that we could control outcomes, we had to make sure that we could get inside of what it was that was inside that supply chain and understand it. And again, ask the same question: can you affect change in the center of that supply chain or not? And if you can, what do you do about it?
Where did you start?
We started with talking to the largest players and finding out what the level of interest was. And I think what you find as you go through this, Lee, is that these are organizations that are publicly traded organizations in most cases, and they're interested in the same thing that we're interested in: delivering a product, making money, assuming that there's going to be a margin in the product, and continuing to sustain that business. And so we started there. We started with the carriers and asked the question, what do we do in this case? And it quickly became evident that if we were going to have a supply chain between organizations and consumers that was going to work, we were going to have to break it down and put it back together again. And put it back together in a way that we thought was going to add value both to companies and to consumers. That's where we started. And we said, what can we break down? What can you start to understand? And so, again, part of this was saying, what can you do in each of these areas? You had to figure out what the verticals were and how do you affect each one of those.
Assuming that we had to change things, if you were reorienting the supply chain, what were some of the root causes that drove adverse outcomes that needed to be addressed?
You use the term root cause, and so that's where I'm going to go to, because there are a lot of causes. But if we think about root causes, again, I tend to think simplistically, and I think in life terms about this. I love for the work at my house. I'm not mechanically inclined at all. So what do? I hire a general contractor. And that general contractor deals with plumbers and carpenters and electricians and all of the complex stuff that I don't understand, not having mechanical or technical skills. What we found was we had a general contractor in the supply chain that was willing to do a lot of different things. And so what's the root cause? The root cause is that we allowed a general contractor mindset in the supply chain. And we had to ask ourselves, if we didn't have a general contractor, how would we feel about the service delivery? How would we feel about the expense, et cetera? And that's where we had to start. And so that concept of saying, how do you destructure this whole supply chain and then put it back together? What are the individual parts of it? Which are the important parts? Which of them fit together? Which can you systematize? Which do you have to do in person? All of those questions were pertinent.
When you redefined what the supply chain looked like and started crafting a vision of what a great outcome could be in the future, what were some of the elements that were key to that reformed supply chain, the better future that we might hope for?
Let's start with the most important part of the supply chain, and that is the beneficiaries of the care. And I'm going to share a story with you. So, I was at a large session with International Paper. We had unions as part of our organization. The largest one was the United Steelworkers. I was at a session with a number of union members from the United Steelworkers. And there was one individual at the table who was from one of our southern facilities, and he was pretty negatively about a lot of different things, right? And I finally asked him the question, is there anything positive going on? And he said, you know what? Healthcare is a positive for me. And I thought, wow, that is not an answer that I would typically hear when I ask that question. And so I started to dive into it. And what was important to him was making the complex simple. He loved the concierge kind of approach that we used to allow him to get help without having to pay for it. Somebody that could provide advocacy for him in those highly emotional times. That's what was important to him. And so as I thought about the what was necessary in the supply chain, and we started with the consumer, that was an outcome that we wanted. We want an experience, a healthcare experience that can reduce the emotion, not increase the emotion. We want a healthcare experience where people feel like they're getting value without unnecessary complexity, that there is a person to talk to when they need to talk to somebody about whatever issue that they have that they don't understand. That's where we started. So that was on one end. On the second part of this, which is the organizations, one of the outcomes that companies want, of course, is they want value, which means what they're getting for what they're paying is something that they can feel really good of. And that number is really big, Lee. It was $500 million a year for International Paper. So how do we derive value from that? And at the same time, make sure that this is a benefit. If it's important to our employees, it's a benefit that we feel great about, not just mediocre or good, but we feel great about what it is that we're doing to attract and retain our employees through a healthcare approach that makes sense.
So over the course of kind of 5 years as you were actively working on this, what were some of the hallmark strategies that you put in place or approaches? And then across that time period, what were the financial outcomes that you got for your health plan?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we started with, the HTA offered a pharma contract, a contract with pharmaceutical benefits managers that was very, very preferable to what we had in place. That's where we started. So there was a data requirement. The data that we provided to the HTA, along with the data from other organizations, helped us to negotiate and to put into place a better PBM contract. That was a great starting point because it was worth, 8 figures plus, right? It was a big number for us. It was a great way to legitimize the work that we were doing. We then started asking the question, well, what do we do with medical, which is 80% of the cost of the 500 million? And the first starting point was, well, let's get rid of what we have inside of this system that we don't want, and that's fraud and abuse, et cetera. And so that fraud and abuse, there are organizations that you can identify that can help you with that. And so we started to work with them, and they found things. They found crazy things, Lee. Things that you should shake your head at. How many gallbladders does a person have that can be removed at one time? Why is there a bed and breakfast in California that's operating as a therapy location for medical and mental health issues? I mean, some of this was just clear. And so we started to get into that. As we started to do that work, we also found areas where we thought, there are high expense areas. Eventually, we got into things like specialty drugs and said, wow, this is a really expensive area. If we shine a bright light on this through a satellite organization that operates independent of the carriers, is it possible that they can find some opportunities for us? There are those types of things all over the place. That's not even starting to say that there are some chronic health conditions, things like diabetes, musculoskeletal, those things that, again, you can find organizations that are satellite organizations to your carrier that can help you. And it's not an expense. It's a value addition, because what you're finding is that those things that they focus on, there are long-term benefits that it way outweighs the cost of doing it.
Oh, I love this. And so at the end of this period, what were the results?
Yeah. So I believe that the best way to measure the cost of your healthcare benefits is per member per month. It takes out all of the headcount fluctuations that you might have inside your organization. It's a per member per month cost. Our per member per month costs between 2019 and 2024 should have gone up on average by 10% plus per year. That was kind of the average in the industry. And so you had a starting point in 2019 and went for 5 years, compounded. You'd expect it to be at least 50%, 75% cost increase on a $500 million base. Between 2019 and 2024, international papers per member per month went down. And so hundreds of millions of dollars. And the cool part was that guy that I talked to at breakfast at the United Steelworkers event had no idea that that was the case. It wasn't part of his calculus at all about what a great healthcare system looked like. What he was cared about was his experience, and that was better, even though the value and the cost of it had gone down. It was a great outcome.
Unbelievable. So now I'm curious, when benefits managers get a good outcome, one of the most tragic quotes I ever heard was a benefits manager who was managing a large health plan, not unlike yours, and I think they were spending around 700 million a year, and we were working with them. We showed them how to save $50 million, and they said, "Oh, we'd love to do that, and these savings would be great, but I don't know that we can get any internal support." And we said, "Well, how is that possible? Because you'd save $50 million a year while improving your benefits." And they said, well, if we save $50 million, we're just going to get a high five. That's the best we can expect from a positive standpoint. But if the wrong person complains, it could even threaten our jobs. And so, we would possibly pass. And that, that hurts my heart to know that that could be the case in any organization,
All
because
right.
I can't believe that senior executives wouldn't be absolutely thrilled with that outcome, but the communication doesn't always make its way through. Well, here you're the CHRO and you know precisely how much you're saving, and you know how that impacts EBITDA and how that impacts things within the C-suite. And I was hoping you could speak to us a little bit about how, with that information, you were able to use that within the organization and within the broader communications to the market.
Yeah, let's clear the deck of the concern about someone having an issue and voicing a negative opinion about it, first of all. Okay. That is not just in healthcare, that is in every aspect of what a CHRO deals with. Okay. So that is something that we deal with every day, every week. And if you're doing it right, by the way, you use that feedback to get better. So let's just start there. The second thing that I think is really important, there are a lot of CHROs today that have really started to understand the value of a human capital strategy. And human capital strategy is not an HR strategy that looks at the HR organization and says, what should we accomplish? Human capital strategy looks at the company and the strategy of the company and says, what is it that we can do that will enable the success of the strategy of the company? I'm a huge believer in human capital strategy. If your medical plan can provide a benefit to both your employees and a monetary value to the company, it is our responsibility to figure out how to do more faster. So we had a great benefits team at International Paper. One of the things that we did was we spent time together, Lee. They knew very clearly how important this was to me, and it was important to me because it was important to the organization. So we spent time together. We talked about what it was that we were doing, how to do it best, et cetera. And so I think that having proximity to the issues, to the people who are dealing with this every day, first of all, the insights of that benefits team was instrumental in helping us to define the strategy. They knew that. They knew that that's how I felt about it. And so we spent time together figuring that out. And so it would hurt my heart too to hear a comment like that. I think that those comments, though, um, while they're relevant, obviously, for the individual who shared them, I think it's our responsibility to pull it apart and figure out a way to actually make a valuable part of this as benefits leaders and HR leaders in an organization.
How could you use the savings that were created within the health plan to benefit the rest of the organization from an operating standpoint, profitability, shareholder value? How That's hard to do a lot of times if you're in a more narrow area handling a single task. But as the CHRO, you obviously had visibility across the entire organization. And how did those savings and that performance translate into overall shareholder benefit?
There's no feeling like being on a analyst call with the CEO and having the CEO cite the benefits cost savings as one of the positive contributions to achieving financial results. It happened two different times over the last couple of years in International Paper. So, what happens when the CEO mentions that? You go back to the benefits team and you say, this is what alignment looks like. If you ever had a question about how your role lines up with the success of the organization, I think you got your answer in that call. It's just so compelling. That's just one side of the supply chain. Go to the other side, though. One of the things that if you have a great benefits team, they not only can do the analytics and understand all the different complexities of the benefits plans and understand all the technicalities, but they're also focused on the end user, the consumer of the care. And so when we had situations, we had situations in International Paper where you had to close a facility, for instance. That's painful. I felt super comfortable sending our benefits team out to that facility to be part of the concierge service for those employees to help them through such a difficult time. So, one of the attributes of a great benefits team, a great benefits person, is not only that they can master the math of this and the science of this, but they can also master the humanity of it.
Love that quote. So some people might listen to you and think, oh, Tom was a very unique case in that he was spending 20% of his time working on healthcare to get these unbelievable results. And I would never have time like that. Uh, I'd like to correct any false uh, impressions on that. Could you talk a little bit about how much time you actually were able to spend on this area, even though it's close to your heart? And if that's similar to other CHROs, maybe you could coach us a little bit on how someone spending that modicum of time can get the same types of results.
During the time that I was CHRO lead, we had between 40 and 50,000 employees. We were global. We had employees in probably 30 different countries. We had customers in over 100 countries. We had multiple lines of business. We were buying, we were selling, we were spinning. There was a board of directors, there's a comp committee, there is a CEO, there's all these people and all these responsibilities. And so that, like so many of my peers, that's your world. And so I don't necessarily believe that it's the amount of time. It is what you do with the time that you're going to spend in this space. And what we did was we said, no more abdication. We're going to get involved. Let me just clarify. I did not walk into the CHRO role as an expert by any means. I was an absolute neophyte in this area. I knew so little. My wife would ask me questions about her healthcare, and I would say, you should talk to somebody in HR. And I just didn't know it. But when you get into it and when you realize how important it is absolute motivation, not to necessarily spend more time on it, but making sure that the time that you spend is strategic and focused, and you remember value and the service aspect of this. It is so important to our companies that we do this well.
Oh, I love that. So, what are the ways? So, say it is what's a typical amount that that you and other CHROs will spend on healthcare among that massive wide array of
Yeah,
priorities?
less than 5%.
Less than 5%. Okay, so
Mhm.
very clear here. You're spending less than 5% on this, but got hundreds of millions of dollars in value out of it. Clearly, you were also relying on a good benefits team.
Great benefits team.
Great benefits. Yes, no, they're stellar. They really are. I have the chance to work with them as well. Uh, how um, how should the CHRO maybe a layer more tactically spend that 3 to 5% of their time in order to get outsized results?
Yeah, I spent very little time actually on the analytics and the numbers. I spent a lot more time with the team, with the leader of the area to make sure that we understood it. I spent a fair amount of time, as you know, with the HTA to understand what it was that this strategy could look like, right? And I've always been this type of HR leader where the value that I receive from interacting with people on a really important topic is probably the most valuable time that I spend. I can be pouring through paperwork and reports and analytics and all that. I can do that. My preference is have others look at it, understand it, come to conclusions, and then let's talk through those things. And so I spent a lot of time with our benefits leads, the folks that are doing this every day. I talk to our employees about it a lot and just ask them one of the questions. If this was important to me, and I was out at a facility, I asked them what their impressions were of healthcare and what could we do to make it better, et cetera. So all of this gets kind of wound together into a template that says this, in order to make sure that I'm doing the right things, we've got to have the feedback of the people that are closest to it, which are the people at both ends of the supply chain.
That's wild. How did you bring your team together into that vision with you? And maybe it is, spending time with them, et cetera. But I, I've met lots of CHROs who do have interest in this area, and their teams couldn't be further off topic in terms of the vision of what can be achieved and the motivation to take action. And I'm curious, you had alignment with benefits teams, and even when there was turnover and change ups in those benefits teams, the new staff that came on to replace were also still totally in sync. And that is very rare. And I would love coaching on how you were able to get that result, because it is not, I have to believe it's not easy because it is very rare.
Both of the leads that we had, so the total rewards leads that we had, while I was the CHRO, neither of them came up through the benefits area. They were generalists, they were HR leaders out in facilities and businesses, et cetera. Now, one of the tests for this role is, do you have the financial acumen to be able to understand the financial complexity of this space? You have to be able to understand that. You have to be super comfortable with data and understanding it. And so that was one of the priorities. Another priority, though, for me was making sure that my total rewards leader had platform skills. Because if you're a total rewards leader, if you want that person out spreading the gospel of this work that you're doing, they have to be able to get up in front of a crowd and move the crowd. They have to be able to talk to the board of directors and be able to make sure that the board of directors understood what the implications of this. They had to be able to talk to senior leadership. They had to be able to stand up when they saw something from a consultant or a carrier that they didn't like. And so the profile of the benefits lead is really, really important. They have to be a business person who understands HR and can develop an understanding of benefits. And once that happens, the cool part about that, once that happens, they start to attract talent that has a really broad way of thinking about this. And so we had about 12 new HR people that we hired off of college campuses every year. Some of them would route through this area. And they wouldn't route through it because that's what they wanted as a career. They routed through it because it was important to HR and to the company. And so you develop a mindset and a culture within your HR organization where this is an important area and it's not completely defined by having specific subject matter experts. We had subject matter experts, but the leadership of that area was someone that could think about this holistically.
I love this. Referencing a conversation we had earlier, I will sometimes hear about this in speaking to different experts who will say something along the lines of, we don't get great performance sometimes out of benefits because it's not expected. It's expected just to keep it quiet or keep it in the mix and just stay within guidelines and manage the vendors. And uh, that's kind of the expectation. And unless you compensate people differently or create structural changes like that, you're not going to get a change in that behavior. But in the earlier conversation, your perspective does not align with that. You didn't make any changes to the way people were paid, but had significant alignment. And maybe you can share a little bit about how, even without any structural changes, that you can still create a sense of importance and alignment with the organization.
Before you ever get into figuring out what the incentive structure should look like, you have to figure out what the goals are. What are you trying to accomplish exactly? And I would participate with the total rewards lead in figuring that out. What do we want from this area during X year? And once you established what those were, you then figured out what the metrics were, what the goals are going to be. There are existing comp systems inside most organizations today, whether it's merit awards, whether it's bonuses, some other variable pay structure, or specific incentive awards. I think there are plenty of vehicles where you can monetarily reward somebody that's doing great work. The interesting part about this is it doesn't need to be any different than any other part of the organization that's adding value. And so you can treat your benefits leaders, and we did, if they're going to be instrumental in a certain area and develop the type of results that we were able to receive over that 5-year time period, we should be rewarding them monetarily. But the reason that they accomplished it is not because of the incentive. The reason was because we identified why it's important, what are we working on, what are the metrics, what are the goals, and then finally, what are the outcomes? That's what it was. And just a side note here, I think that we as leaders frequently underestimate the effect that we have as leaders in spending time with people, in just getting an opinion and picking up a telephone and calling a benefits analyst who you know is an expert in the area and say, I'm working through this. Can you just help me think through this for a second? That's not only clarifying, it's also rewarding to the individual. And I think we often forget about the qualitative incentives in lieu of the quantitative sense.
Everyone, now just a quick word from today's sponsor.
Lemonade for 50 cents. It's for a good cause.
This situation seems terrible, right? Well, what if I told you it actually happened in the United States in 2021? These are the families of people who work for companies just like yours. Give your employees 100% medical coverage with Catalyze Health.
Even as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, how often do I get on calls with my staff on one-on-ones and just say, hey, I'm working through these problems, would love to have your opinion. Being that direct, I sort of assume that I pick things up osmotically, but there's no guarantee of that. And just asking that question, obviously, and any of us, if it goes the other direction, having anyone say that to us just is really high value. And it doesn't take any extra really time or attention. It doesn't change anything systemically, but it absolutely changes the orientation and priority process around how something gets done.
Yeah, people will be able to tell very quickly, Lee, whether you as a leader are actually serious about this just by your behavior. How do you prioritize it? How do you think about it? How often do you think about it? It's very obvious to the team whether it's important to you, and if they feel like it is, that's a huge incentive for most people in this space.
Now imagine I'm a senior HR executive and I'd love to get some of that $100 million in extra value. I need the savings. Maybe I'm avoiding layoffs or tariffs. What advice could you give me to get out of being stuck in the status quo? Maybe just baby steps. What are the simple steps I ought to take?
I'm going to reference my own experience here because I don't know how else to think about this question other than that. The first hurdle, and it maybe was the biggest hurdle, was getting over the intimidation that I felt by this area. And I think that is such an important part of this, Lee. And so there are experts. If you're members of the HTA or you know people who are expert in this space, I think it's really important to start educating ourselves. Just like you would want to educate yourself, if there was a balance sheet item that was important to the company and you're the CHRO, I believe it's our responsibility to understand what the balance sheet item is. Well, this is important too. And I think that getting into the detail on this, asking questions, it requires a lot of humility to acknowledge the fact that you don't know about a space that's under your watch. That was my situation. And so you have to get into it and you have to start asking questions. And so I think that's the first thing. And once you start asking questions at the second and third and fourth level, I think things just start to pop. The fraud stuff that we saw it was easy, right? When getting into some of the areas where, these were repeat types of situations, or these were situations that caused the most frustration for our employees. It's like anything that we do as CHROs. When you start asking the right questions, you use those answers to guide the direction that you go. That's the first step. And Lee, if you want to, I mean, you can just post your cell phone number right on the screen here, because that's the other part of this that I think is really valuable. We have at the HTA, we've got world-class experts on all of this, right? Lee, right?
Yes,
Look at
absolutely.
your colleagues. We have world-class experts so that, you can get the help that you need from the experts. I would strongly encourage people to think about this and say, how truly objective are the resources that you're using to educate yourself? How really objective? Do they have alliances where that's affecting the way that they think about things? So some consultants might have that, the carriers might have that. The cool part about the HTA is the 100% objectivity. The only interest that they have are the two ends of the supply chain, the companies that they serve and the employees and their families that are served by those health plans.
So now we're talking a little bit about alignment. That, as we've established, we have our general contractor who runs everything from the patient all the way to the employer's bank account and all the care and delivery in between. We've acknowledged that GC is trying to earn money for their shareholders, and there's so many ways to do it because there's not a lot of oversight and it's big and it's complicated. We've overcome our intimidation and we're starting to redefine that supply chain. What are some of the things we can do to improve that alignment uh, externally in working with outside sources? I mean, talking about HTA and other organizations that are independent is huge, but what are the additional steps and ways to use those?
So let's establish, first of all, that companies that are self-insured are customers of carriers and PBMs. Agreed? As a customer, we have the right and the responsibility to make sure that we have a relationship at the right level inside of those suppliers of ours that we have in healthcare. And so the first question that I would ask is, do we have those relationships? As we started working with new carriers, I would go to each of the leaders, whether that's the CEO, a president, the head of a certain vertical. I would go to them. I would request an in-person meeting, and we would not, I mean, in the contracts, there are service agreements. What I wanted was a face-to-face meeting where you had a look you in the eye contract, and where we could say, what is it? Why is this important to us? Why is this important to you? Let's make sure that we're aligned, 100% aligned on what it is that we want to accomplish here. What are the check-in points? What are the metrics? What are the goals? And if so, if we get to incentives, so be it. But that is the last part of the discussion. That alignment relationally and what an expectation from a supplier to a customer, which is the relationship that we should have, that's how I thought about it. And so as a customer, I would request to have top to top meetings on some frequency, quarterly, every 6 months, whatever the amount of time is, just to do a check in. That's how I spent part of that less than 5% of my time, by the way, is just making sure that the supplier arrangement that we had was doing for us what we were paying for.
There's some real power to that too, even as I think about it. I was on a call earlier with another HTA member with a similar profile, a Fortune 100 company, and the they were discussing some of the added services that they get from their carriers that are ostensibly against the incentives that those carriers have. And they said, we have a very good relationship with our account management teams. We have built and cultivated multiple levels of relationships with them, and we use the influence of those relationships to override many of the systemic
Mhm.
misalignments that exist. So even though the system and the setup and the platforms in place are misaligned to our incentives, we still have to use them at least for the foreseeable future. And so we can use relationships with individuals that are running those systems to make manual corrections to create more alignment. And I hadn't thought of the fact until you just mentioned it now that a relational level connection can help to override some of the failures that exist in the system.
So, one of my closing comments when I had those meetings was to acknowledge that my success in this role, relative to this space, the success of our benefits team, the success of our company in this space, was dependent on them. And my expectation was that they were going to help us to be successful. And these are business people who have customers. They understand what that relationship should be, and to be able, I was not interested in the same relationship as everybody else had. I was interested in the relationship that we had. And when you take that approach with the other leaders and you start to say, these are the issues, what I found was a high degree of collaboration. All we had to do was make sure that we asked for it.
Jim Rohn has an old talk from many years ago where he says one of the biggest problems people have in business and life is simply that they're not asking for things. Like, are they directly meeting with someone who has the ability to influence a desired outcome, and are they specifically asking for what they want? And that almost never occurs among people who even are aggressively pursuing a given goal. Anyway, your advice right here echoes with that, and I think it's so on your nose. People never think of it.
And again, part of the reason Lee, is what we talked about earlier. Part of the reason that a lot of people don't do that is they don't believe that they've got the requisite understanding of this space to be able to have sessions like that. Got to get past it.
Which is that step one is dropping down the intimidation wall around this topic so that you can treat it like a
Right.
regular business,
Exactly.
like a regular customer buying any other type of good or service. Oh, I love that. Looking a little bit to the future, what do you think are some of the biggest risks that are out on the horizon that are coming up to the way that employers are interacting with healthcare?
I think that, so one of the stakeholders in the supply chain, because there is Medicare in the United States, there is a governmental part of this that has an effect or indirectly on employers because of the fact that the providers of our healthcare are dealing with both our employees and their families, and with Medicare patients, et cetera. So there is an effect on all that. I don't spend a huge amount of time worrying about that. So, what are the risks that we see? There is a tremendous amount of medical technology today that is happening. And I think that a risk or a missed opportunity, perhaps, is if organizations don't understand what's happening in the medical world. Okay. And so I think we have to understand things like gene therapy and ask the question, what impact is this going to have? What's happening technologically? Is AI being used in this space? Is machine learning being used in this space? I talked to a CEO of a healthcare company recently, and they're in the mental health space, and they're using AI to aggregate case information so that they can use the power of quantity to understand what's best for an individual. Pretty cool stuff, right? So I think that one of the risks that we have in this space is making sure that as we think about healthcare, we keep up with all the things that can affect healthcare. I'll give you another example. One of the things that I think about a lot that we haven't talked about today, we don't talk about a lot at the HTA, is mental health. Okay. And so, what is the interplay between physical health and mental health? And how should we be thinking about all of that? Again, it just underscores for me, Lee, the necessity for us as leaders in this space to understand what the context is that's going to be affecting our employees, the decisions that they make, what the system looks like, et cetera. We could go on for a while about those. I think that the risks here, I view them more as missed opportunities than I do as risks in this, just because I think that if we identify what those things are and really get after them, we can really optimize and we can stay with the pace of the system as it's changing to make sure that the pace of what we're providing to our employees and our companies keeps up with that.
Paint the future in any way you like to get to a better outcome, maybe closer to that optimized supply chain that we were discussing earlier. Both
Mhm.
working with the HTA and employer healthcare, what would you love to see? What would be a really desirable outcome?
The HTA is an organization that has experts inside of it. There is a board, there's an executive committee, we have a CEO. The purpose of that, one of the purposes of that organization is to understand what the needs of those member companies are and make sure that there's optionality for them as those companies define their healthcare strategy, right? And so the first part of this is the future, hopefully, will have the HCA continuing to expand its knowledge, its understanding of what the member companies are facing, what the consumers are facing, et cetera. Number two, that companies actually actively execute a strategy. They understand what their options are as they think about their own strategy, the offerings of the HTA. They understand what those are, and they actually execute a strategy and move through a strategic approach that will get them both better care and better value for their care. I think that the third part of this is that the consumers, the people who are using these services, like the guy that I was talking about before, they acknowledge and recognize that not only are their companies doing the right thing, but they're doing it with the help of an organization like the HTA that does it really, really well. I think that that's really important. We've got, millions of members that are represented by the HTA across these 70 plus companies that we have. And so for that group to acknowledge this and for there to be an association between excellence in healthcare, the HTA and the companies that they work for, and finally, companies understand and receive the value that all of this creates for them. That when we ask a CEO or a CFO or somebody in the C-suite, help us to define what it is that healthcare actually does for your organization, how it's performing, et cetera, they can actually answer the question. And they answer it in a way that makes those of us that are involved with this proud to be a part of the success of that organization because of the work we do in this
and that we've
space.
eliminated intimidation from this category. That might be one of the biggest hallmarks of what
Right.
prevents us from taking action to improve it.
I agree with that. I think part of this is having the humility to go after it.
I think that's the antidote to the intimidation, because if you're
It
worried
is.
about looking
Yeah.
bad, you'll never go near something that's so complicated that you feel dumb or uneducated, especially if you're one of many titans of industry helping to lead a major company. You don't want to feel foolish or be felt to be asking silly questions. So you don't want to go anywhere near something that is absolutely above your skis. And so you avoid it, which causes you not to manage it. And you rely on the GC. This has been so enlightening to me, and I really appreciate the time. There's so much of value here, and hopefully this interview itself can go a long ways to helping CHROs and other business executives reduce some of that intimidation to be able to approach healthcare, and with so much at stake and so many opportunities for those who do. Tom, what are you doing next? And if you're open to it, how might people connect with you?
Yeah, so people can connect on LinkedIn. I've got a profile out on LinkedIn. I stay on top of it, and I'm in transition, as you mentioned. Part of that transition is continuing as the chair of the health of the HTA, and so I'm honored to continue in that role and work with all these great companies that are out there. Yeah, transition in life is exciting and scary. I'm looking forward to what's next, Lee, and so we're working on that right now. So. Um, if people want to get in contact, just ping me through LinkedIn. They can go through you or anybody else at the HTA, and I'll make sure to get the message. Um, yeah. Let me just say this in closing. I just think that this is an area that has such a high return for the time that you spend on it, both qualitatively for what it does for our employees and their families, and quantitatively what it does for our companies. I would just urge people to really take a look and make sure that they're understanding what it is that they can do, even in the smallest way, to get started. So I really appreciate the time, Lee. Thanks for all you do for the HTA.
Love that. Thanks so much, Tom. And thank you, everyone who tuned in today. What a wonderful trove of information and advice. Please share this with anyone who might be able to benefit. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on Broken Benefits. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcasting platform. Also, please share today's show with a friend or colleague. It's free to do, and it helps us spread the message to as many people as possible. Until next time.